Here is Pennonia Kekfeny Blue Light, a blue ink. Let's jump straight to the end with my opinion on this ink.
The paper I'm using here is a Maruman Mnemosyne Notebook.
I went into this expecting to be disappointed by a blue that was just too light to be usable because of its name, and boy was I wrong. It's as good as Iroshizuku Konpeki. There is only a little tone variation in dry or extra fine nibs. Otherwise, it is very consistent in tone, and it generally shades very well. On non-fountain pen friendly paper, it performs well, still has something special about it when you're looking at it. It's beautiful, more than just a standard blue. I can see this being a real race between this and Konpeki as one of the best blue inks out there.
All of the writing samples are done with a Retro 51 P51 with a fine nib, a Retro 51 Corsair with a medium nib, a Retro 51 Lincoln with a 1.1 stub.
The pen for today is a Lamy All-Star.
Now that we know my opinion on this ink, let's see how I got there with the first writing sample done on Clairfontaine.
Looking at the extra fine nib, this is the lightest tone that we're going to get. Now, it does not feather and it does not spread. It does shade without a doubt. When you look at without on the second line, the WI is lighter than the TH. The OU lighten up a little bit and the T becomes dark again. And this type of shading is very common for this with the extra fine. Now, I call it lighter, though it holds all the same tones that we're going to see with the other nibs. Looking at the medium nib, it is darker than it was with the extra fine. It does not feather and it does not spread. It does shade, though not mountains of it with this particular nib. Take a look at mountains on the second line, where the mount is fairly dark. The AIN lightens up a little bit, but that S at the end does become quite a bit darker. Looking at the stub nib, it is the same tone as the medium. It does not feather and it does not spread. It does shade, not a take over the page type shading, but definitely there in every word. Take a look at take over on the first line, where the TA are lighter than the KE at the end, and our starts darker on the O and during the U transitions a bit lighter into the R. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding and no ghosting.
Like most inks, this one comes in a bottle. This is how the Pilot Custom 823 fits. And here is the Pelican M1000. Here is the ink level when you can no longer fill a Lamy Safari. There's approximately 6 milliliters of ink left. The next writing sample is done in a Portage Reporter's Notebook.
Looking at the extra fine nib, it is the same tone as the Clairfontaine. It does not feather and it does not spread. It does shade without any kind of a problem. Take a look at himself on the first line, where the H is fairly darker than the M. The SE darken a little bit, lightening into the L, a very dark F at the end. Looking at the medium nib, it is darker than it was with the extra fine, lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine. It does not feather and it does not spread. It does shade pretty darn well. Like I said, I think this is a runner against the Konpeki. Take a look at 100 on the first line. First word, the H is really dark. The UNDRE lighten up a little bit. That D at the end does darken up a little bit. Now, it's not huge amounts of shading. It's there in each word, small amounts, like small on the second line, where the M is a little bit darker than all of the letters around it. But this paper is not fountain pen friendly paper, and it does really well. Looking at the stub nib, it is the same tone as the medium, the same tone as the Clairfontaine. It does not feather and it does not spread. It does shade, though nowhere near as well as it was on the Clairfontaine. If you take a look at outside on the first line, it is a little bit darker than quite on the second line underneath it. And wild on the third line, the WI is a bit lighter than the LD at the end, and the dot of the I darker than all the rest of it. Looking at the back of the page, you could easily continue your notes back here with no bleeding and no ghosting.
There's a lot to learn by doing multiple chromatographies. The one on the left is immediately put into water for 10 to 15 seconds. The one on the right, marked with a D, is let dry for 10 minutes before putting into water. The next writing sample is done on a national brand Steno notebook.
Looking at the extra fine nib, it is the same tone as the Clairfontaine. This means it's a rather opaque ink because it is not affected by the tone of the paper. It doesn't feather, it doesn't spread, it shades as well as it did on the Clairfontaine, showing this is a really strong ink and should be looked at a whole lot more. Looking at the medium nib, it is darker than it was with the extra fine. The same tone as the Clairfontaine. It does not feather and it does not spread. It does shade very well, as was discussed in the beginning when I talked about the fact that it does shade well. Look at discussed on the second line. The DI is a bit darker. The SC darkened just a tad bit more. The USS lighten up a little bit, but the ED at the end darker again. Looking at the stub nib, it is the same tone as the medium, the same tone as the Clairfontaine. It does not feather and it does not spread. It does shade, though not as well as it did on the Clairfontaine. There is plenty of shading here. Take a look at there on the second line, where the H is darker than all of the letters that are around it. They're all just a bit lighter. And to the left of that, the N is a bit darker than the A or the D, though the D during the downstroke does begin to darken again. Looking at the back of the page, you see the ink does get fairly deep into the paper with the stub and the medium, not so much with the extra fine. Now, if you were to shoot, this is a you choice on writing on the back of the page. Based on these two, I probably don't, though if I were using an extra fine, there's no problem. Now, nothing bled through touching the page over underneath, and the ghosting was minimal, if there. It's more the deep ink that's the concern.
Resistance tests are done to see how this ink can be expected to perform on the page, and more importantly, how hard it may be to clean from your pen. The smear is allowed to dry for 3 days before testing it. The highlighter is on the top left, pen flush is on the top right, 1/3 bleach solution is on the bottom left, and water is on the bottom right. The next writing sample is done in a Rhodia notebook.
Looking at the extra fine nib, it is the same tone as the Clairfontaine. It does not feather and it does not spread. It does shade just as well as it did on the Clairfontaine, but we're looking at this more to see how it did with the quad rule. How'd it do? Obviously it did fine. It completely makes the quad rule disappear in the background, standing out all on its own. Looking at the medium nib, it is darker than it was with the extra fine, the same tone as the Clairfontaine. It does not feather and it does not spread. It does shade, probably a little bit better than it did on the Clairfontaine. I'm a bit surprised. Take a look at standing. First word, first line. The ST is very dark. It's during the A into the N that it starts to lighten up a little bit. Keeps that slightly lighter tone through the D. The I gets a bit darker. The N lightens a little bit. The G, beginning of its dark, end of its light. Very interesting in its amount of shading. Looking at the stub nib, it is the same tone as the medium, same tone as the Clairfontaine. It does not feather and it does not spread. It does shade, though not as well as it did on the Clairfontaine, if I must say. But take a look at must on the first line, where the M is lighter than the U. It then lightens again at the S, darkens again at the T. A lot of back and forth, really well done there. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding and no ghosting.
With over 1,000 inks reviewed, let's take a look at some color comparables.
Here is Parker Penman Sapphire.
Here is Pilot Agisse or Hydrogena. Here is Private Reserve Tropical Blue. Here is Robert Oster Midnight Sapphire. The next writing sample is done in a composition lab notebook.
Looking at the extra fine nib, it is lighter and duller in tone than it was on the Clairfontaine, though it is still a very good blue with no feathering, with no spread, with shading, yes, with standing out on the quad rule, yes. Now, am I concerned with this and its run against Konpeki to dethrone it as one of the better blue inks? No, because this paper does tend to dull and ink some. Looking at the medium nib, it is lighter than it was with the extra fine, lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine. It does not feather and it does not spread. It does not shade. It does look like a great blue ink on the page. Still very worth using, even though we're not getting all of the same qualities on this paper. I think what we're seeing here is absolutely amazing. Looking at the stub nib, it is the same tone as the medium, lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine. It does not feather and it does not spread. It does shade where it didn't do it with the medium. It does do it here. Take a look at low hills on the first line, where the L and W of the low are a bit darker than the O of low, where hills is a really dark word. Now, through a lot of this, you can see a lot of tone variation that's subtle, like through on the second line, where the T is a little bit lighter than the H. The ROU lighten up a little bit, but that GHDN get very dark. Looking at the back of the page, every student's going to be happy because there's no bleeding, no ghosting, and they can easily continue their notes back here.
While it's nice to see ink in the same color family, I prefer to see ink to complement the color on the page. Here is Geherban Roule Dance. Here is Pilot Mixable Orange. Here is Robert Oster Maroon 1789. Here is Sailor Studio 770. The last writing sample is done on 20-pound copy paper.
Looking at the extra fine nib, it is a little darker than it was on the Clairfontaine. It does feather and it does spread, and I think the feathering and the spread are manageable for what we're seeing here. I do think you could use it, though it looks like you're using more of a medium nib because of the amount of spread. Serviceable, yes. Great option, no. Looking at the medium nib, it is darker than it was with the extra fine, lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine. It does feather and it does spread. It doesn't shade. It is serviceable still here, not as good as it was with the extra fine. It is really on that line of I probably wouldn't use it, but I do know some people that would, and it's something to keep in mind here. As a blue, on this paper, it's nice, not as nice as it was on every other paper. Looking at the stub nib, it is the same tone as the medium, lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine. It does feather and it does spread. However, I think the feathering and the spreading here are better managed than they were with the medium. Managed about as well as it was with the extra fine, meaning we get a very serviceable situation here. It's usable. It's not a huge problem. It's just something to be aware of. Don't pause in your writing or you might suck all the ink out of your pen with this super absorbent sponge of a paper. Looking at the back of the page, you see there's no taking notes back here because the ink is so deep into it. There's a tremendous amount of ghosting, but nothing bled through touching the page underneath.
So what nib and pen do I think are going to give the best writing experience with this ink?
The paper I'm using here is yellow Rhodia paper.
The extra fine in general is the lightest tone, but not by much, and it does shade nicely. Now, the medium and the stub both look the same in tone and are darker than the extra fine. They both also shade very well. Now, I would bet that people couldn't tell the difference between this and Konpeki if they were side by side and had no indication of which one was which. So beautiful from every pen, regardless of flow and nib size. So here I have to say a dealer's choice. Ink up your favorite pen and enjoy.
I hope you got something out of this video, and thanks for watching. I want to let you know that the best way you can support this or any channel is to let retailers know where you heard of something if you go to buy.